My name is Anissa Collins, and I am from IRRE. So welcome to our series that we're now having monthly. This one is about making the most of review opportunities. We figured it was a good time of year to have that conversation since for our secondary schools, we're getting ready for exams oftentimes. And for all of our schools, K-12 and everybody out there, the end of the year is a great time to really think strategically about what do we spiral back in as review, so that we can end the year as strong as possible and have the kids as ready as possible. All right. So Randy, were you able to join us?
I'm here, but still have some technical difficulties going on in the background. So you can go ahead and
No
get us started.
worries.
I'll jump in where I can.
Okay, great. Thanks, Randy. All right. So with me is Randy Lober, our senior instructional specialist. Yes, so just before the webinar started, he was having technical difficulties. We all have been in his shoes. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. So our ICANs, our learning targets for today, is one, to identify strategies to facilitate individual review, and then the second one, to identify strategies to facilitate collaborative review. We know that both of those are really essential and critical for kids. And the thing is that either way, it gives the students a different way to process and to communicate that information. And so that's why we wanted to spotlight a couple of each for today. Our ground rules are to begin and end on time. So this is a 1-hour session. We'll be ending at 4:30 Eastern. Stay focused. We always have a lot to try to get out to folks to help support. So just make sure that you stay focused as we go through. But definitely don't ever hesitate to ask questions. Be respectful of everybody else, and that includes the mute, so that we can hear everybody who's speaking. Assume positive intent. You guys don't have to be here on a Tuesday afternoon, so we appreciate that you are, and everybody is here as a learner. Please use the chat feature for both back channeling and for questions, as well as responses. So we love to hear your thinking, and so we're looking forward to seeing that today. And then again, mute your microphone when not speaking. So we definitely encourage that sharing of ideas and questions in the chat. We will be monitoring the chat throughout, as well as recording both this, the chat and the session in general, so that others who weren't able to be with us this afternoon can see it at their own time, as well as for those of you who are here, you'll be able to go back and review it if you'd like. So we always start with some kind of welcome and warm up to get our brain started. Today, what we're asking is to take just a moment to think individually here. What are some of the ingredients of a good review session? If you'd like, you can feel free to put your thoughts into the chat. But we just wanted to give some of that think time for you. What are some of the ingredients of a good review session? Okay, and that overarching question is going to take us directly into our conversation today. So we're really going to look at 4 strategies, 2 for that individual review and 2 for the collaborative review. For the individual review, we're really going to look at incredible shrinking notes and one-pagers. And then for the collaborative review, we're going to focus on placemat consensus and shuffle team discussion. Now, you guys may have seen or used these in the past, and that's fantastic. We realize that all of the strategies that we bring are not new to the sun, and partially that's because we try to bring those ones that are tried and true, the ones that have some data behind them that show some good student results from them. However, we really want to focus on that being very specific and intentional in how we use it, and then just help support each other as we think about how we do that in our classroom. So for individual review with incredible shrinking notes, the first thing we do is to select a topic to focus on. And when we're talking about our review, that could be a unit. It could be a smaller review of a particular topic or skill concept from earlier in the year that the kids were still struggling with. Students consult their materials and jot everything they know on either an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper or a 3 by 5 index card, your choice. But it's that idea of a brain dump, right? That we want to make sure that we try to get the kids to think of anything and everything that they can remember and that they can access around that particular topic. Students review then what they wrote and write what seems most important on either a 3 by 5 card or a 3 by 3 sticky. So you see where we're going with that idea of incredible shrinking notes. If you started with the paper, we want to go to an index card. If you started with an index card, we want to go to the sticky note. So being more and more concise and condensed as we go through. Lastly, then students review what they wrote one final time to write what seems most important on either a 3 by 3 sticky note or a 1 by 2 sticky note. So again, that incredible shrinking notes. Now, for years, a lot of us in the classroom have been using note cards and such for larger exams or assessments, or maybe even our unit assessments. What we found is a lot of the kids feel very comfortable with that, right? It's almost a security blanket, if you will, of, oh, I don't have to remember absolutely everything. And what they don't quite realize, at least they don't realize it as consciously, is the fact that the more and more that they're writing it, the more and more that they're thinking about it, the more they're studying. And so of course they're going to do better. And so that is the idea of this incredible shrinking notes, is going from everything that I can think of and know to what's really most critical for me to remember around this topic that I know that I'm going to be asked to discuss on the assessment. And that way we can get also away from those 1-page longer notes cards and get into those smaller 3 by 3 stickies or 1 by 2 stickies. And again, just kind of weaning the kids off of that idea that I have to have everything in front of me, but rather that iterative process of really studying what's most important.
And that's one thing that we definitely appreciate about the sort of iterative nature of this, right? It's one thing to have students write one time on that bigger piece of paper, whatever it is, or that index card, to have them ready for an exam or an assessment of whatever the case might be. But as they keep writing, that's another 2 or 3 times they've been asked to interact with material in a way that doesn't feel so much like drill and kill, right? They are instead prioritizing, what do I know? What do I not know? They're going through that self-assessment, having that inner dialogue of, what do I need to put on this card in order to feel most prepared for that exam or for that assessment? And by the time they get down to the smallest denomination of whether that's a 3 by 3 sticky or 1 by 2 sticky, they're likely at a point where they don't need it anymore. They've revisited the material at least the initial time you taught it, probably in your initial review session, especially as we're thinking about like end of course exams. They saw it again, earlier in the year. They've seen it here in review sessions here, and they're just really refocusing and nailing down that knowledge. So for that reason, we value this strategy as a great way to get students involved with their individual review.
Okay, great. Thanks, Randy. Yes, and as we said, that iterative process for sure is part of the research aspect and why it's a high yield strategy. Because anytime we can get the kids to do that type of thinking, but slightly different each time, the better off that they are. So considerations for doing that incredible shrinking notes in class. If we're in person, materials management, of course, for each student is going to be a concern, especially due to local social distancing and COVID guidelines that you may be following. It can occur all at once. However, so that's one thing that everybody can be doing this at the same time. Or it can occur over time. In other words, we might do, and also all 3 iterations can be done at once, one back to back, and taking like a full period to do that, or a full block of time for a particular in elementary. But can also occur over time, such as each day we might do a different part of the iteration and shrink it a little bit more each day as we get closer and closer to that assessment. So either way, it can be done that way. For digital, there are ways to create various size spaces, whether we change the slide dimensions on Google Slides or PowerPoint, whether we do word count limitations. So it's almost going from an essay, if you will, to a tweet type of word count situation. And then it also could be a time limit if we wanted to do audio recordings. Instead of having kids write those notes, those incredible shrinking notes, we might have them orally explain those notes. Randy, anything else to add for those considerations that I missed?
So the changing slide dimensions might require some technical knowledge, and we're happy to speak to that for individual questions in the question and answer period. One thing that really strikes me about this is the audio recordings as well, right? Or video recording for that matter. If we were to use a Flipgrid and have students kind of do that brain dump and then window the thinking down, that's another powerful tool, especially for kids who may not necessarily be may not know what to put on paper in the first place, right? For some kids, it's easier for them to verbalize everything and just get everything out as opposed to just writing it down on paper. So that leveraging that audio recording to engage kids and provide them another way to access the strategy is a great way to support them in reviewing what they know and prioritizing what they still need to know.
Okay, great, thank you. So now let's take just a moment for you out there, our audience, to reflect. If you'd like to share your thinking, please feel free to put that in the chat. But we're going to give everybody a little bit of thought time here. What are some potential benefits to students in using the shrinking note strategy? Both from anything that you remember us saying and just in thinking about it as a professional educator yourself. What are some of those potential benefits to students? Okay, and as we said earlier, feel free to continue if you want to share any of those thoughts with us in the chat, please feel free. If not, just make sure you're doing that on your own. So thank you. So our other individual review that we'd like to talk about today is one-pagers. For a given topic, decide on essential elements to include in the one-pager. So we're almost creating that outline. What is it that we want to make sure is part of that one pager? Provide a structure for students by creating a layout that tells students where to place each element. So thinking about a graphic organizer type thing, and take advantage of the dual coding theory. And I'm going to have Randy talk about that here in a second. But make sure that we're creating and communicating a simple rubric for evaluating the performance. One review doesn't necessarily mean a day where it's not graded, because a lot of times the review in and of itself can give us some really valuable evidence of where students are in the learning. So Randy, do you mind popping in and talking about the dual coding theory for us?
No, I don't. I was just finishing up a message to one of our attendees here in the chat box. So when we think about dual coding theory, it's the idea that our memory has two separate related systems. One that is very word and vocabulary centered, and one that is very image centered. So oftentimes the benefits of a one-pager is that we encourage students to put their knowledge on the paper in both ways by encouraging them to both trigger both those memory systems through words and through images. And by using those memory systems in tandem, really help them to build stronger connections between the content in question. And we'll see some examples of what that looks like here on some future pages.
Okay, and here we go. So Randy, if you don't mind, I'm going to have you walk through these examples for everybody. Okay.
So we're starting here with a short, with a template that we're going to walk through and kind of apply to different content areas. So imagine, if you will, that these are our templates, right? That students will have these defined spaces to go ahead and dump the specific thinking in. In an ELA setting, for example, perhaps at the end of a novel study, we might ask them to put the text title at the center. So they have an opportunity to either interpret that artistically or not, but at least to give us a really focused lens for their thinking. Then around that, we'll ask them to engage in some both vocabulary-based and some image-based reviews. So in the upper left-hand box, we might ask them to kind of splash the themes about. So if we are looking at a coming-of-age story, there's lots of struggles that they might have. There's love, there's identity, there's independence, all kinds of different things. They might splash those themes around in that box and choose to add a visual of at least one of those themes. On the right-hand side, the upper right-hand side with the meaningful quote and explanation, we might have students artistically represent that quote by, if it's particularly scary or powerful, they might choose to emphasize certain words and then add their own explanation, whether written or through kind of sketch notes of why that quote was impactful. We can then have them compare and contrast how different authors treat the same topic. And we can also, again, take advantage of that dual coding theory by asking them to construct a plot diagram too. So we have a really good idea of what they know and what they don't know about that particular text.
Okay.
And the same template, right? The same four squares can be used in different ways across content areas. So if I were to move to a social studies unit, my social studies units are likely guided by an essential question. And so in that center square, we'll have that essential question and then provide students the opportunity to answer that. The study of primary sources is an essential part of the social studies discipline. So we might ask them to cite 3 of their sources and provide some quotes to support their answer to that essential question in the center. Again, as you go around the diagram, we'll ask them to find some additional images to support that answer so that the answer is really carrying a lot of the text-based memory, right? But the images they select and curate to add to their one-pager can definitely support that visual coding. And indeed, in the bottom left-hand corner, we ask them to do a little bit more of that text-based answer to think about a summary of 3 other events that support that answer. So it's again giving us students a really strong central focus for what they're dumping their brains about, and then going ahead and access their resources in various content, various things that they have available to them to go ahead and construct answers and support those answers there to really bring that essential question home for them and make that really sticky for them. And we might also do the same thing in math. So math can be a very visual discipline, though it's not always necessarily seen that way, especially by students who see it as a kind of a finite thing where I'm simply plugging and playing numbers, right? So a one-pager can help to open up the dialogue and open up the understanding of math. So if I have a key concept in the center, again, so maybe we're focusing on the Pythagorean theorem. All right, so as in the center. So we might then take some steps to summarize that. We might take an opportunity for students to highlight and produce some visual examples of some common errors that either they went through or that they've seen. They might have a chance to highlight some real life applications of that theorem in practice and see where exactly that theorem might be applied. And of course, connect it, coming back full circle up to the upper left-hand corner, do some either verbal and visual connections to the concepts that underlie that study.
Great. Thanks, Randy. And for the considerations for the one pager, they're actually very similar this time, whether you're in person or digital. The first thing is just thinking about how do we create or find those templates to provide that structure. Randy and I showed a very simple one with essentially 4 squares and center, the center aspect of the topic or the main concept or the essential question. Similar to maybe like a Frere model that we might see. But there could be other templates out there or other way that you want to do that. So it's just that idea of how do we create or find that. If it's in class, we're using it regularly. We may have those hard copies created for kids. Digitally, it's of course, we could possibly use Google Slides as that vehicle to capture work because it's oftentimes fairly easy, a little bit easier sometimes to create those templates in slides and have the kids interact with that. The other thing then gets into the second bullet or the third bullet on the digital side, which is consider ways for students to share their thinking. In person, we might have them in pairs. social distanced, and they're actually talking physically, physically spaced with each other. In the digital, if we're using Google Slides, it could be a case where they're doing a type of virtual gallery walk where they're looking at everybody else's one pagers and taking some ideas from one person's and adding it to their own. So it's a different way that the kids may be sharing their thinking. They may not be actually talking orally to each other, but for somehow we want them to make sure that they share that thinking and gain an understanding and knowledge from one student to another. So that idea of cross-pollination of ideas and that supportive piece, even though it's an individual review.
Mhm. And certainly sharing their thinking is important. And one vehicle that helps them share their thinking, but also to get that thinking out in the first place, is providing the structure that you can find in a template. Oftentimes in early iterations of teachers or early iterations of one pagers, when teachers first try it, they see a lot of these fantastic works of art along with these really detailed textual explanations that students have put together. And that's great if your students don't need the scaffolding and structure that a template might provide. But if you can identify some key elements of the work and some elements that are essential to your discipline, such as the social studies example, where we're looking at various primary sources and images to help support and build an argument, that gives students an idea of what to look for and how to compose their one pager, so to speak. So that the idea of filling up one paper, it doesn't seem so insurmountable. It's the idea of filling up four or five or six or seven or eight discrete chunks of knowledge that I'm looking for, which can often facilitate that thinking for students.
Great, thank you, Randy. And so now it's time for you, the audience, to stop and jot down some ideas that you have. Please, again, feel free to share in the chat bar if you'd like. But what are some potential benefits to students in using the one-pager strategy? What do you see as a possible help with kids as they review specific topics or concepts, either that are current or that we're spiraling back to as we get to that end of the year? Okay, and hopefully you had a chance to write down some of that thinking. Somebody had shared that idea of, both of those, the incredible shrinking notes and the one pager. Unlike some of our more traditional reviews where it may be a series of questions that we ask kids, and a lot of times it reflects or mirrors the assessment itself. Unlike those, this really puts the onus and the ownership on the students. Where they're pulling that information, they're pulling that review from themselves. And so that very much can really help to give them not only that ownership of understanding and of learning, but also just that idea that, okay, I don't have to be given everything, right? That's the one thing we're always hearing from our colleagues out there, is, getting really frustrated and trying to discourage kids from that spoon feed thing. And so these are some of those review strategies that really help to support that weaning kids off and really having that onus on them. Okay, so thank you for sharing. All right. So now let's look at the two collaborative reviews. The first one that we'd like to share today is Placemat Consensus. In this instance, we're divide a collaborative space for students to record their thinking. That could be a large piece of chart paper. It could be a very large whiteboard. I had a colleague who had the type of tables that the kids could write on and easily wipe off with Windex at the end of the period. So whatever that is, use it, whatever that is, but just that idea that there's space, collaborative space for the students to record their thinking, hence the placemat of the name. First, we ask students to individually respond to the prompt in their space. So again, we have some kind of an open-ended prompt where we're asking kids to brainstorm, jot down, recreate, think, pull from their memory information around a particular topic or concept. When time is called, then each student has their own information, their own answers that they've already written down. But when time is called, we ask students to reach consensus on which ideas are most important, and that goes into the center circle, that consensus circle that I'll show you here in a second. So our placemat might look like this. If we've got groups of 4 going, each person has their own quadrant that they're writing their thinking in. And then after that time is called and kids have had that individual think time, then that collaborative aspect happens where person 1 shares one idea that they had, one thought, one memory. And then they have a conversation. Is that really important? Did somebody else have that as well? Do they all agree, come to consensus that that is a very important point around that particular topic? If it is, they write it in the consensus circle. If not, it doesn't go there. It just gets checked off on their own personal thinking so they can keep track, and no harm, no foul, no worries. And they just move on to that second person. So again, it really helps, just like individuals shrinking notes, incredible shrinking notes help to, in an iterative process, try to go from the large to the concise. Placemat consensus does something similar, where we start with the individual brain dump, if you will, that brainstorming, and then together in a collaborative nature, we start to narrow that and make that more concise. Some considerations that we want to think about in person, consider passing the paper to prevent crowding. So it could be if we have got social distancing, we don't necessarily have the kids all lumped together at a table in a group of 4, but we may have them spaced out a little further. But we're passing the paper, so we don't have that. Consider students jotting thinking on sticky notes to place onto the mat. That way, again, they can do that at their own seat and then go to a table or put it on the wall, a different space. Consider a digital implementation. Even though we are in the classroom in person, a lot of our schools that we talk to still use the Chromebooks. They still use a lot of things digitally, just because the concern is, we don't know if we need to go back to online. And so we might do it digitally as well, even though they're with us. And then, of course, that time limit on individual thinking and consensus building. We don't want too much time to go. So it's kind of setting a particular time limit, perhaps 2 minutes, and then watching the kids. If people are still really, really involved in jotting it down, give them another minute, go minute by minute. If not, then just call it off. And the same thing with consensus building. We don't want that to go so far that we then start talking about the movie we're going to see on Friday night instead of the actual topic. For digital, I'm going to have Randy talk to us a little bit about some of those ideas that we might use for our schools that are still virtual, or if we want to use that digital option in person.
Well, no matter what, you're still going to want that collaborative space. So it's an idea, it's a question of where am I going to create that collaborative space? And that really depends on your individual comfort level and what you know and what your kids are able to do. So that could be creating a template similar to the one Anissa displayed for us in a Jamboard. You could do the same, something similar using a table in Google Docs if you're not quite tech savvy enough yet to implement Jamboard. And certainly you can also share a Google slide presentation where each group or each student has slides and they come back together in a breakout room to reach the consensus if you are doing those sorts of things. No matter what, though, we don't want to give the impression necessarily that placemat consensus is limited to everybody talking about the same question at the same time. As I was talking with the AP Human Geography teacher, and if you are one, good luck to your students today, and I hope they did well. But as I was talking with one last week, the courses broke down into 7 different units, and they had 29 students in their class. So they said, hey, that's a great opportunity for me to have a few different conversations going, right? Where throughout their review process leading up to the exam, they had different groups of students working on an essential question from each unit. And then doing a bit of a gallery walk to compare the thinking across the different placemat consensus templates that were created. So a placemat consensus is certainly a strategy where the group around the table, so to speak, is actually coming to consensus, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody in the class is working on that same topic.
Okay, great. Thank you. And so now, once again, it's yes, my fantastic wait time, your wonderful think time. But jot down a few ideas. Please feel free to share in the chat bar as you guys have been doing. What are some potential benefits to students in using the placemat consensus strategy? How do you see that helping support kids as they're reviewing particular topics or concepts as we get to the end of the year? Okay. All right. And hopefully you got some of those notes written down. And let's move forward to our last one then. So our last strategy that's a collaborative review as well is called shuffle team discussion. And essentially, as the teacher, what we do is we create decks, and I'm going to put that, we put that in quotations, decks of 4 or more open-ended questions. And we distribute that to each group of students. Now, the reason why we say decks is that in the most traditional sense, shuffle team discussion truly is a card, index card per question that we've either written or that we've taped or glued a cutout of a typed question on. Now that is time consuming for us as teachers. And so if we've got a classroom helper, fantastic. If we don't, then that deck might actually be one piece of paper per student or per group that has the questions listed. And the cards then that the kids shuffle could just be 1, 2, 3, 4, so that it's the number that correlates to the particular question. Either way, the idea is that there's some kind of shuffling going on because that's that random aspect of what question are they going to choose. It's interesting with the psychology of students, of our younger students, K-12, that idea of choice, of even that random choice of just shuffling cards and selecting one randomly, that choice is just enough for a lot of kids to engage in that conversation then, instead of saying you have to answer question 1, then question 2, then question 3. It's amazing. But it also gives a game type of feel to this type of review that a lot of the kids enjoy as well. All right, so we've got our cards. Either they have the question on them or they're 1, 2, 3, 4. One participant chooses a card and shares their response to whatever that question is. All other participants then respond in turn after they've listened. So the idea, because it's open-ended, is that no matter where you're at around the group, whether you're the first person, second person, or fourth person to go, there's something else you can add. It can be the yes and or the yes but. Yes and I'd like to add this. I've got another idea, or yes, but I'm not sure if I agree with you. Here's my thinking. When all have responded, then the next participant chooses a new card. And we repeat that until the time is called or all questions have been answered. Now, here's the great thing in the flexibility of shuffle team discussion, because all of the questions are really, and that review is around one particular topic or concept. It really doesn't matter if they get through one card and they have an extremely deep conversation around it, or whether they get to all 4 or 5 cards, however many we have. The idea is that no matter how many cards they get to, they've had a fairly well-rounded conversation. And again, it's that idea that we may be guiding by the questions that we ask, but the kids are absolutely in the driver's seat when it comes to that response. And because of that collaborative nature, they continue to build on each other's thinking. So one of the things that we want to think about is in person. Like I said, we may consider putting all the questions on a half sheet and distributing one to each student or to each group. We can also project a die or a randomizer for groups to select questions. So that way we try to minimize the amount of materials at all that we're using at this time. We want to make sure that as the facilitator, we're creating and enforcing time discussions. Now, as I said, it doesn't matter usually whether they take a lot of time for one question or whether they go through several of them, but it's up to you. If you really feel like, 5 minutes is the limit for any one question, if you go longer than that, you're very much concerned about what they're talking about, then you might put that type of time limit on. And also just letting the kids know that they've got 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever that time limit is for the entire review. And then again, consider digital implementation, which I'm going to have Randy talk to us about here, of how do we really think about doing shuffle team discussion if we're in that digital realm.
One reason, especially if you are back to school, you might consider still using the Chromebooks or whatever devices you have to facilitate the digital implementation, is to limit the time in which students are in close contact with each other. And so the devices, while we're still inside the same four walls, can help to still preserve some of that physical space between us. So whether you're in person and thinking about digital, or your students are at home and you are either at home or in the building as your leadership has decided, here are some things to consider for that type of implementation. So we might want to put all the questions on a single doc or slide and make sure students all have access to those so they can see those questions are visible. We would then assign students into breakout rooms for them to be able to have those conversations that we're talking about. And that this has illustrated some of the structure of. For them to select that question, we might ask them, provide them a link to the chat in the chat to a randomizer, or ask students to otherwise pick a question they might want to use. And again, that aspect of timing, especially in breakout rooms, can be helpful. And as Anissa talked about with the in-person implementation, that could be you have 20 minutes to talk about as much, many of these as you can, or after 5 minutes, we're going to come back to our main room, and I want each group to share something they talked about before I kick you back out into breakout rooms. For you guys, for your group members to choose something else, to choose another question and have a discussion around that. In either case, you're asking students to have a time to structure conversation and asking them to bring some evidence into thinking, some evidence of their knowledge back to the full group. So there's some accountability for being an active participant in the review and not necessarily looking forward to a shuffle team discussion time as a time where I'm not responsible for reviewing.
Great. And Randy brings up a really good point in terms of that accountability as well as sharing of evidence. The other ones that we looked at all are they have writing at the core. And so there's a definite physical artifact that they have, whether that's a hard copy or digital, but there's a physical artifact of that thinking. Shuffle team discussion is very much more of an oral aspect, an oral review. And so that idea of, if we feel like we need to have it more structured, if we need to have a deeper amount of accountability, then it could be that we also ask kids to, before they come back and share, to jot down a few bulleted points that was discussed around each question. So something like that, so that we have some of that more tangible evidence, as well as, again, it just gets kids more and more iterative practice and exposure to writing and thinking about the topic or concept. All right, so once again, we're going to ask you to take a moment and stop and jot some of your thinking. What are some potential benefits to students in using shuffle team discussion strategy? Again, whether that's something that we're currently learning and reviewing for an assessment, or whether it's something that we're spiraling back to and bringing forward at the end of the year to strengthen before we go off to summer break. Okay. So just as a review of the review, we looked at 4 strategies today, 2 for individual review, the incredible shrinking notes and the one-pagers. For the collaborative review, we looked at placemat consensus as well as shuffle team discussion. In all 4 of those, there is a different amount of thought provided from and guidance provided from us versus what we're asking the kids to do. But in all of those, the kids are very much doing some more open-ended thinking and pulling from every resource and every nook and cranny and corner that they have in terms of what is it that they know about a particular topic and concept. So something to kind of open up the review a little bit more than a traditional review of some questions that we might ask kids. Okay, so for our last stop and jot and processing time for you, of the 4 strategies shared today, which is most likely to promote success for you and for your students, and why? Not every strategy fits every teacher the same way, just like gloves. And so one of those strategies may speak to you more than others, either because of your own personality and style or the kids that you serve. So which one do you feel would most likely promote success and why? And again, please feel free to share in the chat if you'd like. Okay. And I wanted to share one teacher's response to this question in the past, which is a science teacher. Sometimes when students are in science and math classrooms, they feel like there are right and wrong answers. And they feel like it's just a matter of facts, right? Or a matter of problems that I get right or I get wrong. The idea of doing shuffle team discussion, which was her choice of strategy, was that fact that it also helped to elevate and to show kids that there are open-ended aspects to mathematics, to science. There are places that we can have discussion, we can have conversation. And it's not just a bulleted list of facts and words that we have to know the definitions of, and then we move on. So that was her choice and the reason why. All right. And so that brings us to the end. We're finishing a little early today, and I figured nobody minds too terribly much. But what we would ask is that when we finish this session, a feedback survey will pop up. We please ask that you go ahead and fill that out for us. Feedback from you is very helpful for us to continue to do the job that we do. If you have any questions, you can feel free to ask them at this point. Randy and I will stick around for a while, or you can always ask us via Twitter. And then on that survey, the first question is going to be an exit ticket. And so we're going to ask you again, just to share with us, if you haven't already in chat, of the 4 strategies shared today, which is most likely to promote success for you and your students and why? We always like to hear from you guys of what you feel is most beneficial and why. Okay, Randy, any last thoughts from you?
One thing that struck me, especially as you were talking about the teacher who used Shuffle Team to highlight that all of our disciplines have opportunity for open-ended discussion, is when teachers first kind of view these strategies for the first time, it causes them to reflect a bit on their own assessment construction, right? If I have typically been a teacher whose assessments are grounded more in rote thinking and rote memorization, at first glance, some of these strategies may not appeal to me very much. And that's because there are some very specific, very finite pieces of information or knowledge that I feel it's important for kids to know, and indeed maybe essential for that discipline. But one point of reflection that it often brings up for teachers, and we bring up with teachers in coaching, is that idea is that there are always those opportunities for discussion. It's a matter of being intentional about highlighting them. And indeed, in all of our standards, if we were to go through subject by subject and state by state, students are asked to participate in some sort of discourse. And that discourse, what better place for that discourse to occur than on their more formal assessments, for them to be able to read, write, to think like a historian, like a student of English, like a mathematician. So I would encourage you, if this made you feel a little nervous, to kind of sit with some of those feelings for a bit and to think about your own assessment strategies and whether if these open-ended strategies felt uncomfortable to you, to see if that prompts an examination of your own assessment practices as well.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you again for being with us this afternoon. We really appreciate it. Those of you who are here for the first time, as well as those who are returning. And just watch out for information around upcoming webinars or slow chats on Twitter that we may have. But again, we'll be around for a few minutes if you have any questions that you'd like to ask us individually. If not, have a great afternoon, a great rest of your week, and we thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you soon.